Hola, buenas tardes a todos. Es un placer recibiros aquí en los webinars de SADE Poll que hacemos con Do Better, con SADE. Y bueno, para mí es un honor tener hoy a un invitado que muchos de vosotros habréis leído, se llama Gabriel Zucman, ahora le presentaré. Y también tenemos a dos invitados más que ahora también os presentaré. Vamos a hablar de temas muy relevantes para la actualidad, sobre todo, bueno, Gabriel es muy conocido por investigar dónde se esconde el dinero que falta por pagar en los impuestos, y las otras dos personas que nos acompañan, Miguel y Clara, también son expertos en impuestos. So I'm going to switch to English. Because I think Gabriel's Spanish is not very good. My French is probably worse than your Spanish. So it's going to be easier like that. So Gabriel Zuckman is a French economist. He's an assistant professor at Berkeley. Did his PhD at the Paris School of Economics. He's been tremendously successful with his publications, really young. And he received I think the prize for the best economist under 40 years old in France. And he's obviously published in some of the best academic journals, and he's published two books, The Hidden Wealth of Nations, in 2015, and The Triumph of Injustice with Emmanuel Saez recently at the end of 2019, before the whole world changed. Thank you so much, Gabriel, for being here with us. And we also have Clara Martinez Toledano, who also did her PhD at the Paris School of Economics. I think they coincided with Gabriel, so they know each other. She's in New York, Gabriel is in California, and Miguel is in Madrid, here basically a couple of kilometers away from me. And now Clara is doing her postdoc at Columbia Business School, and soon she will become an assistant professor at the Imperial Business School. Thanks for joining us, Clara. And Miguel Almunia, he did his PhD at Berkeley, and then he moved to Warwick, and now he's an assistant prof at CUNEF here in Madrid. And we are also very proud to have you here, and I hope you will push Gabriel very much in all the things he will tell us today. So let me start by maybe explaining very quickly a couple of things on the structure. So we have basically 1 hour. I will start asking a few questions to Gabriel, and then Clara and Miguel will also ask questions. We are being broadcasted live in YouTube and LinkedIn. Welcome everyone that has already joined. I think we are more than 100 people. And also you can ask questions in the chat here, and I will receive them here. I'll try to collect them at the end and do a few questions from the audience, so everyone can ask Gabriel whatever they want. So let's start, Gabriel, talking about globalization and inequality. So basically, one of your core arguments is saying, look, there is increasing inequality, but particularly within some countries in the advanced economies. And although there are a number of explanations for that, you say, look, the huge problem is that the rich or the very rich are not paying taxes, and they don't do it either for income tax because they manage to go to places where they don't pay taxes and move their wealth there, and also because multinationals don't also do the same and go to places with low tax. Those multinationals are normally owned by the same very rich people. And this obviously structurally is a problem because it's not sustainable over time. The winners of globalization pay less and less. Probably the welfare system won't work. So tell us how bad the problem is, how big the numbers are. You've done a lot of work in trying to put some numbers in this, and particularly if you can focus a bit on Europe and how bad the problem is within Europe. How much money are we losing because this money is sent elsewhere and these taxes are avoided? Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to have the chance to discuss these issues with you. So what we've seen over the last decades in Europe, in the United States, in many countries, is what we call the triumph of tax injustice, which is the combination of two processes. One is the rise of inequality, and the other is the decline in tax progressivity. And this process has been particularly extreme in the US, where income and wealth inequality has increased a lot, and where the tax system used to be very progressive in the middle of the 20th century and has become much less progressive today. But we're seeing, to varying degrees, the same phenomenon happening in Europe. What we're seeing is that the main winners from globalization, that is the big multinational companies and their shareholders, instead of paying more taxes, have been paying less and less, while the groups of the population who have not benefited as much from globalization, or sometimes have suffered from it, like small businesses, like low-wage workers, like retirees, have tended to see their taxes increase with more taxation of consumption, with value-added taxes, higher consumption in some countries of wages, while at the same time, the taxation of corporate profits went down, the taxation of wealth declined or was abolished in many countries, the taxation of capital income was removed in many countries in Europe from the progressive income tax schedule, tax capital income at flat rates. And I think this process is not sustainable. If globalization means ever lower taxes for its main winners and higher taxes for those who don't benefit from it, we all understand that neither politically nor economically this can be sustainable. And so there is an urgency to think very concretely about different forms of globalization and different ways that countries can integrate without a race to the bottom with the corporate income tax rate, without the abolition of highly progressive taxation. And let me just finish this answer by saying that the forces of tax competition, tax avoidance, tax evasion have been particularly strong in the European Union for the very simple reason that there is no regulation of taxation at the EU level. As you know, taxation, any decision about taxation requires unanimity by all the member states, which in practice is equivalent to enshrining in the law or in the treaties the idea that there's going to be tax competition. Any country can choose its own tax rate, even a tax rate of 0% on corporate profits, for instance, is compatible with EU treaties. And so we've witnessed in the EU a very sharp decline in the taxation of these multinationals and high-income individuals.
I think you didn't answer one of the questions, which is about the size of the problem. So how much of the tax base is eroded as a result of people sending their money on multinationals?
Okay, so there are several ways to answer that question. So one key phenomenon has been the shifting of corporate profits in tax havens. And we have estimates about the magnitude of this shifting. And what the data suggests is that each year the equivalent of 40% of all multinational profits, that is profits made by corporations outside of the country where they're headquartered, are shifted to tax havens globally. That's something like 700 billion euros today. And the main losers from this shifting, according to the data, are the non-haven European countries. That includes very much Spain, that includes Germany, that includes France. So multinationals, including in particular American multinationals, book a lot of profits, make a lot of profits in these countries, not book, but make a lot of profits in particular, because markets are large in these countries. They have lots of customers, but the profits end up being taxed and end up being booked and taxed at a very low rate in places like Ireland, in places like Bermuda, in places like Luxembourg. And so according to the estimates that we have and that you can see on our website, missingprofits.world, we have estimates for each country, including, for instance, you can click on Spain and see how much Spain loses in corporate tax revenues. We find that for the non-haven European countries, about 10 to 20% of their corporate tax revenues are lost because of this profit shifting. So that's a quantitatively significant phenomenon, and it also feeds a race to the bottom and a certain pessimism where policymakers, both on the left and on the right, have become convinced that in a globalized world, it's too complicated to tax profits, and so the only path forward is to cut the corporate tax rate or to give special incentives to corporations.
Yeah, so it's definitely for small economies, it's a very beneficial business, right? That's probably the main political problem we have. If you tell them, I mean, Ireland, Luxembourg, etc., if you ask them to bring up their corporate taxes, they will probably radically disagree because it's very profitable for them.
That's a very important point, and that's something that it took me a bit of time to realize, although it's actually pretty obvious. But I remember that maybe you remember that at the time of the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, Ireland was in trouble, and they asked for help from the IMF, the ECB, the European Commission. I remember at the time, some people, for instance, in France, where I was doing my PhD, were saying, look, fine, but there should be counterparties, and so you should, in particular, increase your corporate income tax rate of 12.5%, which is too low. If you have a budget problem, deficits, debt, start by raising taxes a little bit. And the answer from the Irish officials was, no, we're not going to do that because it will actually cost us money. 12.5% is very low, but actually, no, we are not going to increase it. It will be bad for our finances. And at the time, I thought, oh, this is ridiculous. This can't be true. The rate is so low. Of course, you increase it, you're going to generate more revenue. But it is actually true. Now I understood why it is true. So the reason why it is true is that when you are a relatively small country, or a very small country, you can take Malta, for instance, another EU member state, and you tax foreign profits at very low rates, usually way below the statutory rate of even less than 12.5% in Ireland, then you can attract a lot of profits, a huge artificial tax base from the rest of the world, which is going to be huge compared to the size of your domestic economy. So that by applying only tiny rates to this huge tax base, you can generate a lot of profits. And indeed, when you rank countries by the size of their corporate income tax revenues as a fraction of their national income, well, you see that the countries that generate the most corporate tax revenues are actually the tax havens. Number one country in the world is Malta. Then you have Ireland, then you have Luxembourg, and at the very bottom of the scale, you have the US, you have Spain, you have France, you have the bigger countries that have much higher tax rates. So yes, these tax havens, they have incentives, strong incentives to actually, in the current system, keep tax rates very low.
But that's not because of the Laffer curve, Pastor, but rather because they are stealing basically to
absolutely. That's also extremely important. The reason why, at first glance, you might think, okay, low taxes, more revenues. That's exactly what the supply siders in the US used to say, after Laffer. Well, the only difference is that in the Laffer world, in the Laffer curve world, when you cut taxes, what happens? People work more, people innovate more, people create businesses, and GDP rises, global GDP rises. But when Malta or Ireland offers very low tax rates, what happens is that it's not the case that global GDP or innovation rises. They attract profits at the expense of other countries. So it's a pure zero-sum game, which indeed you could summarize by saying it's just pure theft. And so it's pretty important. The point I want to emphasize, however, and I'm sure we're going to talk more about that, but it's very important to understand that there is nothing inherent in globalization or in European economic integration that should lead to that outcome. There are many other forms of globalization where you could combine economic integration and high corporate income tax rates and change the incentives of tax havens.
I mean, particularly within the European Union, there has been a lot of debate, right, to say, look, we share all the benefits of the single market. We should probably start at least tending towards a harmonization of the tax base, so these things don't happen. But let me ask you about something else. So before all that, we were seeing this inequality rising, and the demand for public spending was obvious, increasing public spending in terms of the demographics, because we have an older population. Now we have also the green transition that we need to finance, and it's very costly. And now with this crisis we are going through, there are new demands. We will probably need, I mean, beyond all the challenges that automation was causing us, now we have new humongous challenges on this in a number of economies to finance the social protection of the millions of workers that are running out of jobs. We don't know until when, right? Because of the pandemic. We also have an increasing demand of better health services, etc. So this doesn't work. So at some point we need to do fiscal reforms that actually work. Normally there's this collective action problem when you talk about the wealth tax, etc., and the proposals you've made, because you say, look, if I tax the others, the money will go elsewhere. But at the same time, there are options to tax on your own, right? And you've been obviously the ideal world would be to have everyone agreeing on a tax, but that's very unlikely. So you've thought about other alternatives. Could you explain us a bit what those other alternatives are?
I think in the current situation in Europe, the objective is not to raise taxes across the board. In the European countries, most of them have high tax to GDP ratios. Maybe they could be higher. Maybe there is a democratic will for higher tax collection, but by and large, that's not the issue. There was this big transformation in the 20th century when taxes rose from 10% of national income to a range of 40 to 50% of national income today, and we're not going to go to 100%. The main question is how to raise taxes in a fair way and in a sustainable way. That is, how to make sure that those who see their income and wealth grow the fastest, instead of paying less, pay a bit more. So that the others who see their wages stagnate actually pay a bit less, that they have more purchasing power. And to do that, the main challenge is how to address the forces of tax competition and tax evasion and tax avoidance. In turn, the solution to this problem is, first, you need international coordination, international cooperation. But second, once you've said that, you've really not said much. The question is how you arrive, how you obtain actual harmonization and cooperation. And here, what history shows, and when you think about these issues, you realize that in practice, the way to obtain harmonization and coordination is to start, at least initially, with some unilateral action. So one good illustration of that is what happened with bank secrecy. 10 years ago, there was a complete bank secrecy. Swiss banks refused to send any information to foreign tax authorities. Today, there is an automatic exchange of bank information, which is imperfect in many ways, but it exists. And how did we get there in 10 years? It's because in 2010, the United States under President Obama took unilateral action, basically threatened Swiss bankers with economic sanctions if they refuse to cooperate. And under this threat, they agreed to cooperate. Now, I think there is a lesson here, and I think something that's similar to that could be applied to the issue of corporate taxation. So basically, what I think we need is some countries playing the role of tax collectors of last resort. So right now you have multinational companies that, like Google, for instance, book a ton of income in places like Bermuda. In 2019, Google made $20 billion in revenue in Bermuda, where the corporate tax rate is a relatively small tax rate of just 0%. And once they've booked their earnings in Bermuda, that's it. Nobody's going to tax them. So what's missing is a tax collector of last resort, a country or a group of countries saying, if you pay too little because you managed to book your profits in tax havens, we're going to collect more taxes. We're going to offset that. For instance, if you have customers in Spain, if you operate in Spain, but you had a very low effective tax rate in some foreign countries, Spain, we are going to collect part of the difference, the taxes that you've avoided abroad. And any country can do that unilaterally. That's what's important.
How easy is the implementation of that? Because what you're saying basically is, look, if you don't pay the taxes because you do this fiscal engineering globally, what we will do is to say, look, let's take an amount of the sales, an equivalent amount of the sales you have in this country, and then we'll tax you proportionally, right? But then this company might say, look, but I already pay taxes there, and that's legal, actually. The OECD allows me to do this, and I'm not doing anything illegal, right? So it doesn't seem so easy. I mean, it sounds great, but...
No, it is actually great, but it is also very practical. Let me show you how this could work. So let's take a very concrete case. Take Apple, for instance. Take the case of Spain. Spain, the Spanish tax authority today knows the amount of profits booked by Apple in each of the countries where Apple operates. And it knows how much Apple pays in taxes in each country. Why? Because there is an automatic exchange of country by country reports across tax authorities. That's one of the things that the OECD did, and that's a very positive development. So the Spanish tax authority has that information and could do the following computation. Okay, we take Apple, and we're going to compute their global tax deficit. What is their global tax deficit? That's the difference between what Apple should pay if it was subject to an effective tax rate of, let's say, 25% in each country where it operates. Take the sum of all of that, and you compare that to what Apple effectively paid. The difference between these two things is the global tax deficit of Apple. Now, we all agree that the Spanish tax authority can make that computation tonight. Number one. Number two is, okay, if there is a tax deficit, that is, if Apple has an effective tax rate of less than 25% in at least one country, we, Spain, are going to collect part of that tax deficit. And how is that going to be done? We're going to say, if Apple has 10% of its global sales in Spain, for instance, we are going to collect 10% of the global tax deficit, not all of it, but just a portion of it. Okay, so is this doable? The information exists. There are all sorts of conditions that are put to access the Spanish market. We can add an extra tax. And this extra tax involves no double taxation because by definition, Apple would only have to pay this extra tax in Spain if it had a tax deficit defined as paying less than 25%, not a very high tax rate, in at least a foreign country. And so just the basic idea is, look, our own domestic corporations that operate in the local Spanish markets, they have to pay 25, 30% in taxes. And so there's no reason that big US multinationals now come selling products in Spain, but can get away with paying 5% or 0%. We should equalize the situation, the level the playing field, as they like to say. And so we will collect kind of remedial taxes to level the playing field. So I emphasize the point that all the information exists. This is practical. This is not violating any kind of treaty of any sort. And any country can do it alone. And let me just finish by saying, okay, let's imagine that I've convinced you and that Spain next year, starting January 1st, applies this tax. What's going to happen? Well, if I'm right, and we'll see, Spain is going to collect more taxes. All of a sudden, some of the US multinationals that were not paying much in Spain are going to start paying some taxes in Spain. Then other countries are going to look at that and are going to see, wow, that's nice. Spain managed to make these companies that have a tax deficit pay more in Spain. So there's money on the table for us to grab. Let's also play this role of tax collector of last resort. And so in 2022, you see France, you see Italy doing the same thing. And now let me finish with that. Once sufficiently many countries are playing the role of tax collector of last resort, basically you've changed globalization because there would be no incentive anymore for multinationals to book income in tax havens. This would be offset by higher taxes in Spain, Italy, France. Because of that, there would be no incentive for tax havens to offer low tax rates in the first place. And so you would see places like Ireland, places like the Cayman Islands actually increase their tax rate. And so you move from the race to the bottom that we've seen over the last decades to a race to the top, where countries would still compete, but they would not compete by offering low tax rates. They would compete by providing the best infrastructure, by having the most highly skilled workforce, and so the best universities. And so you move from a form of globalization characterized by a very negative form of competition, tax competition, to another form of globalization that's characterized by a very positive form of globalization, one that's good for the people, competition for good schools, good universities, good infrastructure.
Good.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Gabriel, I share definitely your diagnosis of the problem, and your solution sounds appealing. We might want to think about the incentives that companies have in how they report the profits in the countries where they are being taxed with this proposal that you just outlined. An alternative proposal that was done a couple of years ago or a few years ago by your colleague Alan Auerbach and Michael Devereux from Oxford was slightly different, but it was also trying to fix the same problem. They were proposing basically a destination-based tax. So corporations would pay based on where they sell as opposed to where they are located. So if Google decides to locate in Bermuda, it's going to pay nothing, but it sells everywhere else. Their proposal was more trying to change the perspective of the tax system and tax Google based on what they sell in Spain relative to what they spend in Spain. And they also made the argument that countries could unilaterally adopt this system, and that would give incentives to other countries to adopt it. Do you think that other proposal has advantages or disadvantages compared to the one you're making?
That's a good question. I think it has some merits, and it is more of a radical departure compared to the current situation. The proposal I'm making is, in some sense, it's easier to predict what would be its consequences because it's keeping the system as it is. We're still taxing profits. We're still defining profits the same way. We're just saying, look, if you've managed to pay low taxes in some country, that's going to be offset by higher taxes elsewhere, with these countries choosing to play the role of tax collector of last resort. And so it's a bit easier to understand what will be the economic implications of such a proposal. Whereas with destination-based corporate cash flow tax, many things change. You have, exchange rates in particular are supposed to adjust, and that is the ultimate economic consequences of such a change are harder or harder to predict. There was also the concern at the time of the discussion about destination-based cash flow tax of whether this was compatible with WTO rules, and there was a concern. And I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know what's the truth here. But there was a concern that this was actually not compatible with WTO rules. Whereas what I'm proposing here, the countries paying the role of tax collector of last resort, it's just a new tax, that comes on top of the corporate tax, and that applies only to the extent that a company is paying too little abroad. And so that has nothing to do with WTO. That doesn't fall under the scope of EU treaties. That's just a matter of pure national sovereignty.
Clara, if you want to jump in and you have any questions.
Yes, I mean, I was curious to know your thoughts about the current situation in the EU. So we know that in most countries, for instance, wealth concentration has been increasing. It's more moderate than in emerging countries. And we know that due to the COVID crisis, public debt, it's going to skyrocket it because we will need more public spending. So what do you think should be the role of the EU in this context? Like, how should the EU deal with the fact of the mutual debt that the European countries will have in the coming years?
That's a very important question, and I think these questions of how are we going to deal with the debt, how are we going to deal with the budget situation, there's one good way to address those, which is through a democratic debate in a representative parliament or assembly. That's how things happen in Spain. That's how they happen in France. That's how they happen in England. And that's not how they happen in the EU, unfortunately. The EU has a democratic deficit, which is absolutely enormous. These questions of debt, of responding to crises, are decided by heads of states in summits, in the middle of the night, behind closed doors. There's not even a public record of what's being discussed. And every time there's such a summit, and there's been many of them over the last decades, usually there's a grand proclamation, announcement that considerable progress has been made, solutions have been achieved, the crisis is fixed, and then you look at what actually has been decided, and it's very opaque. It's very hard to understand. It's very unclear whether it addresses the structural problems. So my point is, nobody has the answer to how we're going to deal with the debt. The answer can only be provided by democratic deliberation in a democratically elected body that's representative of EU citizens. So, in other words, these questions, the EU needs to enter in a new phase where the EU Parliament needs to have the power, in my view, to raise taxes, which is the basic parliamentary power, the basic power of a legislative body. What characterizes it is the power to actually raise taxes, decide collective spending, do that in a transparent manner. And I think if there was such a thing, there would be debates, but I think we would move collectively towards more cooperative solutions, common taxation of corporate profits, maybe a common taxation of very high income individuals, maybe a common taxation of very wealthy individuals. All these taxes would work much better at the EU level than at the level of individual member states. And so that's my hope for the future. So I don't know the answer, but I know how we should obtain these answers.
I will let you now ask more questions. I have a very quick question. We've talked a lot about corporate taxes, but not so much about income. You had the Gérard Depardieu effect in France when there was an increase in income taxes in France, and here I think we went to Belgium or something to pay less taxes. It was a big thing. so what should you do with the rest of taxes? Income is one of them, and then related to this, you have the VAT. So one way of correcting the problem that the Nordics have found is, let's try to find really efficient taxes that we actually can collect very easily, like VAT, consumption taxes, and then we will redistribute through spending, right? But that doesn't seem, you don't seem to like that so much either. Can you address these two issues on the income and what do you think about pricing VAT and this Nordic way?
Yeah, I think this logic of let's collect efficient taxes, which happen to be regressive, like consumption taxes, and let's offset that through progressive spending, is flawed in many important ways. First of all, it's not clear how consumption taxes are particularly more efficient than, let's say, a well-enforced, with little avoidance or little evasion, taxes on income, on corporate profits. In an optimal tax system, let's say if we could perfectly well observe and tax income and wealth, because there was a good cooperation, a good collection of information, good international coordination. In such an optimal tax system, I'm not aware that consumption taxes are part of such an optimal tax system. If you ask economists what's the optimal tax system, the way they tend to think about these issues is, there's some trade-off about efficiency and equity, but you want essentially to tax, you want to tax income, right? You don't want to tax consumption. So I don't know why people have become convinced that somehow consumption taxes are particularly, efficient. I think, in other words, you can invest in income taxation to make sure that there's as little avoidance and as little evasion as possible, and the income tax is really the core of the modern tax system. The deeper problem, and that's the more important point, is I don't think there is sustained trust that's possible in governments that structurally take more from the poor than from the rich. Okay, so billionaires don't essentially pay consumption taxes because they consume such a tiny fraction of their income. So for them, the VAT is negligible. Working class people, they spend sometimes more than their income, and so they pay the VAT, and it's a high rate. And so I think if you do that, for a long time, you end up with a lack of trust in the government. You see the yellow vest in France. You see the history of tax revolts. Over centuries, is the revolt against indirect taxation and against the non or low taxation of the elites. So that's not sustainable. I think it's important to have progressivity at the level of the tax system itself, or at least to define minimal norms, like a minimal norm of justice in terms of taxation should be that the tax system should not be regressive. We should not have lower tax rates at the very, very top end than on average, but it turns out that in many countries it is actually regressive for the reason I was mentioning, which is in European countries we rely a lot on value-added taxes, and billionaires don't pay value-added taxes. So we should at least have not, a regressive tax system. You could be more ambitious and define a norm of justice where there should at least be some progressivity. I think it's very important to have a well-functioning democracy and trust with trust in institutions.
Miguel, Clara, I'm sure you disagree with some of the things Gabriel just said. Jump in. I think it's interesting to listen also to different views.
So, Clara, go ahead.
You can go. I can go later.
On the debate on the VAT, so there are some points that I share with Gabriel. It definitely, in theory, it's a tax that it's regressive, and in practice, it is. Some studies end up showing that it's not as regressive, at least in European countries as it looks. I know Gabriel has done some estimates for what would happen with a VAT in the US, where because the degree of separation of the top 1% in the US from the rest is much bigger. Really, a VAT would be a lot more regressive. But I was thinking more about the big picture question. You're talking about how the tax system should be progressive in how much the government takes from high income and low income. I think we want to think also on the spending side, right? And when we think about whether the fiscal policy is progressive or regressive, think about tax and spend. So in Europe, we have some models in Nordic countries where the VAT has a high rate, and they do have a more powerful welfare state than we have in the South. So there's a trade-off there, right? So I would like to hear your thoughts on what's the trade-off, because it might be that a country like Spain could have a higher VAT and then really power up the welfare state with that extra revenue, because we know one thing the VAT is good at is at collecting revenue. So how do you consider those two models?
I think the Nordic countries are very interesting and historically built a pretty progressive tax system with pretty ambitious wealth taxes. Denmark used to have a high wealth tax. Norway still has a wealth tax. Sweden abolished its wealth tax only quite recently in 2007. It's true there's been a change in progressivity in Scandinavian countries, but it's a relatively recent development. If you look at Sweden, it's really around 2007 that things have started to change, and it's a bit early to say what are going to be the consequences of that. I think there is a reasonable concern that it is going to lead to more inequality down the road, and it might make the Swedish model less strong. And it was built not on flat or regressive taxation, it was built on more progressive taxation. Look, I think both taxes and spending are obviously very important. I think if Spain tomorrow, if there were two options, one is you double the VAT, and the other is you think hard about how to better tax income, including corporate profits, and about how to tax wealth. And I'm happy to talk about that. And I'm convinced that there are practical ways to do that, even in a unilateral manner. Of course, it would be better in a coordinated manner, but even in a unilateral manner. I think if you have these two options, I would take the second option. It seems to me a more sustainable option. It seems to me something that is going to work better with the electorate. It seems to me that this is going to address the need, the desire for justice. So how can we make that happen? Let's talk for a second about wealth taxation. I love to talk about wealth taxation with people in Spain, because there's such a fascinating history with wealth taxes that Clara studied. And my feeling in many of these conversations, people end up saying, "Oh, look, it's impossible. We've tried that. It's been a big failure. It will never work." Now, the main argument is a bit like in France, is essentially mobility. Wealthy people are going to move out of Spain. What can you do about that? Hey, but you can do things about that. That's the answer. What can you do? Well, imagine you've become very rich in Spain. You've become a billionaire. That's good for you. That's great. That's in part because you've benefited from Spanish infrastructure. Your workers have been trained by Spanish teachers. All of that has been funded by Spanish taxpayers, so they all contributed to your success. So now, is this legitimate? Is there a natural right to move out of Spain, once you become very rich, and stop paying anything in Spain? The answer is no. You have to continue paying. Can Spain make its expatriates pay a bit of taxes in Spain? The answer is yes. Let's say you've been a tax resident in Spain for 30 years. Spain could say, okay, if you've been a tax resident for 30 years, you're going to have to continue paying taxes in Spain for, let's say, 5 or 10 years, maybe depending on the number of years you've been a tax resident in Spain. Does this exist? Yes. The US is an extreme case where the taxation is based on citizenship. So let's say you were born in the US, you move when you were 6 months, you have to pay taxes in the US until the day you die, with credits for foreign taxes paid. In my view, it's too extreme. But what Spain and other European countries are doing today is the polar opposite. You move out of Spain, and starting January 1st, you don't have anything more to pay in Spain. That's too extreme. What I'm proposing is a middle ground, when you have to continue paying for some years, okay? And that will dramatically reduce the incentives to move to low tax places and reduce the threat of tax competition. So my point, just to summarize, is the way that wealth taxation has worked in Spain, like in most other European countries, maybe except Switzerland, is not satisfactory. These wealth taxes were indeed pretty bad, archaic in many ways. They were not using enough information collected from third parties, not good enforcement, no proper way to deal with expatriates, no good way to measure the wealth hidden in Switzerland. But the answer, when there is something that doesn't work, there are two possible answers. One is let's get rid of it, and the other, more constructive option is let's try to make it better. Let's try to fix it. Let's try to reinvent it so that it actually works. And that's doable, as I just said.
Clara, do you have any comments about that?
So I'm pretty sure you know about that, but Spain is also very particular in the sense that our wealth tax is decentralized to the regions. So that regions can choose which tax rate to set, and they can even set a zero tax rate like the region of Madrid is doing right now. So what do you think about this decentralization of wealth taxes? Do you think that it is still sustainable to have a wealth tax despite the fact that this is decentralized? Or should we think of other ways to tax wealth? And this is, I think, a very policy relevant question right now, given that, as I said, public debt is going to skyrocket in Spain, and we need to think how to raise taxes.
Yeah, that's very important. I think, generally speaking, the taxation, the progressive taxation of income and wealth, the taxation of very wealthy people, high-income individuals, it always works better at a centralized level, at a federal level, than at the decentralized level. Why? First of all, because of tax competition. Second, because federal administrations usually have more resources, access to more information to enforce the tax. And so, obviously I'm not against, regions having their own fiscal autonomy, and that's important, but for the specific question of how to tax the very wealthy, that is never going to work at a very local or very decentralized level. It has to be done at a federal level, ideally at the EU level, ideally at the world level. There are second-best solutions, that can work. Like, for instance, as I described, Spain, the country could have its own wealth tax that could work relatively well. But then the more decentralized you get, the harder it gets to tax the very wealthy. So generally, that's the problem.
Mm-hmm. And maybe a follow-up question. So skepticals about the wealth tax keep pushing more towards the taxation of inheritances and estates. So why have you been so in favor of a wealth tax when there are already countries that have progressive inheritance tax and estate taxes? I'm not saying I'm against the wealth taxes, but I just want to know your thoughts about why is it important to tax wealth on top of inheritances and estate taxes?
Yeah, I think that inheritance taxation is very...
I think it would be good if you guys develop the arguments of both sides, so the audience understands what are the main arguments.
Yeah, so basically the main argument I can elaborate on that. So basically what happens is that skepticals about the wealth tax argue that if you tax wealth, so that is wealth that you accumulate throughout your lifetime, this will damper investment and growth because people will not, for instance, create businesses, etc. And on top of that, there is also the argument that people will move their wealth to tax havens, where tax rates are very low or zero. And on the other hand, people are saying that if you tax wealth, you are double taxing because you are already taxing capital income. So these people tend to favor inheritance because they say that you only tax at the end of your life when your children are going to inherit it, so you are not creating any distortions in the accumulation of wealth throughout your lifetime. So these are the pros and cons, and I want to know the thoughts about Gabriel regarding inheritance taxation versus wealth taxation. Yes.
Thank you, Clara.
I think inheritance taxation is very important, and it's so important, and I think we should do it more often than just when people die. For instance, each year, which is an annual wealth tax. So the inheritance tax is very important to limit the intergenerational reproduction of wealth, but it's not enough because you can accumulate a lot of wealth during your lifetime, and wealth is a good thing. At least for most of the population. For most of the population, wealth is safety, and so that's important. It's important to accumulate wealth. Well, for the very, very rich, wealth is not safety. They are not accumulating for precautionary motives. Wealth is power. It's the power to influence policy making. It's the power to influence the prevailing ideology by, buying newspapers, creating new media, think tanks, or foundations. It's the power to influence markets by buying competitors. It's the power to fight for a lower tax bill by, fighting the tax authority in court and so on. And I think
to give money to the poor.
Sorry?
Wealth not only leads to bad things. It could also be that wealthy people give the money to the poor, right? I mean, just highlighting that side of it.
It's also the power to decide what you're going to do with your wealth, and you can create foundations and give money. But it's fundamentally, it is power for the very rich. And I think there's a case to be made to say that this power needs to be regulated. At least a complete non-regulation strikes me as a bit too extreme. So the idea that we should put absolutely no limit to wealth accumulation by billionaires, that it's totally fine if Jeff Bezos owns 1 trillion or 10 trillion or 100 trillion. There's no number that's too high. I think this idea is a bit crazy, frankly. So I think there has to be some limit. There has to be some regulation. And the exact way to regulate extreme wealth is with a wealth tax. The inheritance tax is not enough because, look, Mark Zuckerberg is like 36. He's not going to die anytime soon. So we're not going to wait for 2060 or 2070 or whatever before we start taxing the tech billionaires, for instance.
You've been very vocal about the wealth tax, and you advised some of the candidates in the Democratic Party primaries in the US, and you helped them design different proposals, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. Neither of them won, and now there's a different candidate, Joe Biden. And even though you have been defending the position that most of the electorate would support a wealth tax, that even cities in the US, where we would think that people might be more conservative, they are in favor of a wealth tax. Why do you think it's so difficult for politicians to bring this on their platform? And why do you think the two candidates that were defending this type of platform didn't make it? And I think the problem is similar in Europe. I think a lot of the electorate would favor higher wealth taxes, but parties that are defending the opposite platform are managing to get a lot of support. So what do you think is going wrong in that political process from bringing what the electorate wants to policy? What is not working?
That's a very important question. I think the answer is different. It's not the same for Europe and for the US. So I can talk briefly about both. In the US, there's the main problem is that you just have many people who don't vote, and they've given up on voting because they don't feel represented by Trump or by the Democratic Party as it used to be, and they don't vote. And what someone like Bernie Sanders, his bet was that by talking more to these people, he could increase participation and win. And look, that didn't work that time. It's a process that's going to take years, maybe 4 more years, maybe 8, maybe, it takes time. But that's the critical thing to realize, that less than 50% of Americans vote in the presidential election. That's so important for the future of the US, even the future of the world. That's a real problem here. In Europe, things are different. Well, there's also the same process of part of the working class, the young, minorities who don't feel represented and vote less and less. That also happens to some extent in Europe. But when it comes to the wealth tax, in Europe, many people just sincerely believe that it cannot work, especially in the context of the EU, where there is tax competition, no regulation, free mobility of people without an EU regulation of taxes. And they sincerely believe that, and it's just a matter of explaining very simply and very concretely why this sincerely held belief actually is not correct. Actually we can do better, and there are concrete solutions. In the US, people are not worried about tax competition. The US is a bigger country. They don't think that billionaires are going to move to Singapore or whatever. It's just that although a vast majority of the electorate supports a wealth tax, too few people in the end vote in elections.
Cool. There are a number. I mean, Clara and Miguel, you have the right for one more question if you want. If Gabriel gives us 3 minutes more, it's still 2 minutes to go. And then I will probably add one of the questions here. I go down. You want me to jump directly to the questions here in the chat?
I mean, maybe, I want to ask one last question, just also to know your general picture view of globalization. And so you have really studied in detail who are the winners and losers from tax competition across the globe. And I want also to know, and especially I guess the listeners are also interested in knowing, which are your thoughts about this alternative model of globalization? So how can we continue with globalization, but in a more sustainable way? So is it more investment in education? Is it like a rise to the top by high tech, but like taxing appropriately? So which are your thoughts in this regard?
Yeah, I mean, in brief, my thought is replace the current race to the bottom by a race to the top. Use the resources to invest in the public goods and services that are so important for well-being of the majority of the population, education, health in particular. And the problem is that it's something, when you say it like that, it sounds like obvious and common sense and a bit of a boilerplate. The main question is how to make it very operational. So how do you actually tax more the winners from globalization? I've tried to illustrate that with the wealth tax, taxing expatriates, with the corporate income tax, collecting the tax deficit of multinationals, acting as a tax collector of last resort. I could illustrate this idea with income taxation, with the need to regulate the tax avoidance, tax evasion industry, how you make sure that it's hard for wealthy individuals to actually evade taxes. Well, the key question is how you regulate the suppliers of tax evasion services. So the point is that yes, there is another way to, I could illustrate that with the idea of a financial registry, of recording wealth, creating transparency. That's so important to be actually able to tax wealth. So there is a lot of work, these are just ideas, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done to make these ideas even more operational. But the point is that they are out there, and so there is this alternative form of globalization that is something that could materialize, and I think will actually materialize in the next decades.
So, Gabriel, 2 quick questions here from the chat that I'm going to directly read, and you pick the one that you like the most to answer, okay? So, Joaquin Munoz, who's the Global Sustainability Director at NATRA, says, is the ideal world of balanced tax payment from multinationals only possible whenever the US administration agrees? If even the digital tax agreement of the OECD, is it only feasible when the US plays its role. And then the other question by Miguel Castilla says, what about taxing data? The way they capture, store, and operate data players like Google, Facebook, or Amazon is not only taxing the benefit, it is regulating the market they have created.
So my answer is kind of answering the two questions at the same time is Europe needs to act, on its own. The solution is, there's no reason to think that the solution is going to come from the US or to believe that only the US can change things. The European Union is as big or even bigger an economy as the US, more populous, huge market, has a lot of power. So it has the power to regulate the tech industry, to collect taxes in a fair way. And so, no, let's not wait on the US doing anything in that area. Let's do it ourselves, ideally at the EU level. And if it's impossible to do it, straight away at the EU level, at the Spanish level, and then other countries will follow suit.
Cool. So thanks very much. Thanks very much to the audience for the many questions they have asked that we couldn't actually address. Thanks so much, Gabriel, for taking the time. I know it's 8 now. It must be 9 in the morning already in San Francisco. And thank you, Clara and Miguel. I think it's been very interesting, and it's quite impressive that we managed to keep the audience talking about taxes, which is which is not the most sexy topic. But thanks so much, guys, for being there, and thank you, Gabriel, for the great work you're doing.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.